Thank you for tuning in to the WOLA podcast. I'm Adam Isaacson. I'm here to remind you, as always, that these podcasts are free and ad-free. But WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America, is an independent organization. We do operate entirely on gifts and donations, so please do support our work. The easiest way to do that is by going to WOLA.org and clicking on donate right there at the top right. So this is our sixth episode of 2026, but only our second that is 100% focused on Venezuela, despite all that's been happening since the January 3rd U.S. military operation that extracted Nicolás Maduro. Yes, our last episode with Mark Unger focused a lot on environmental organized crime, especially in Venezuela's Orinoco mining arc. But we haven't done a 360-degree view of the situation in Caracas, in Venezuela, since a few days after the attack. So we just recorded an episode here on March 10th, 9 weeks later. This time I'm talking about it with Laura Dib, again, who directs WOLA's Venezuela program, and Francisco Monaldi, who directs the Latin American Energy Program at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy in Houston, Texas. We're talking about Venezuela's oil sector at a time when some investors have been giving the country a serious look and when oil revenue has started to flow. You can hear me actually voice some shock that it's flowing directly into the U.S. Treasury with a really alarming lack of transparency. But okay, you may be like, why is WOLA doing a podcast about oil and economics? Are we the Wall Street Journal now? No. Laura and Dr. Monaldi make very clear a few tightly related things. First, Venezuela needs to sell oil in the short term if it is to recover. There is no other short-term way to dig out of its deep economic hole. Two, firms aren't going to invest in the country's energy sector unless they can be confident that the rule of law is improving. Third, rule of law doesn't just mean some sort of predictable dictatorship. In the Venezuelan context, it is inextricably tied to recovering democracy. And fourth, that means transparency and accountability. And Washington, too, needs to be far more transparent and accountable than it is being so far. Look, Laura and Dr. Monaldi explain this far better than I can in this introduction, but they make clear that decisions being made right now and in coming months may affect Venezuela's political and economic outlook for many, many years, decades. So let's listen. Francisco Monaldi, welcome to the WOLA podcast.
Thank you.
It's an honor to have you with us. And Laura Dib, great to see you again. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Adam, for having me.
We haven't had a discussion about Venezuela since the week after the operation that extracted Nicolás Maduro. So I'm glad we're back talking about this. And I guess I would just start, Dr. Monaldi, with the general question. Marco Rubio and other Trump administration officials have been saying in public comments that Venezuela and Venezuelans are much better off now in mid-March than they were 8 or 9 weeks ago before the Maduro operation. I mean, what sort of nuance would you add to that statement?
Sure. Depending on how you look at it, no doubt that, for example, Venezuela's revenues from oil have improved to a significant extent because basically the U.S. government removed the blockade that implemented in December that had led to a collapse in Venezuelan oil exports and even some reductions in oil production. So if you look at also the previous, say, 10 months in 2025, Venezuela was exporting 80% of the oil to China, to the black market, and just a little bit to the United States at a full price. So just the reduction of the discounts is a significant improvement. And of course, that doesn't take into account the recent spike in oil prices because of the crisis in Iran. But of course, there's still a significant question mark, which is the following. That money is flowing to an account controlled by the U.S. government. And the U.S. government is so far disbursing some of the money through the Venezuelan banking system, allowing for less devaluation of the Venezuelan currency and significant change in the expectations of economic agents in Venezuela. So that is creating that sort of optimism that we have seen in some of the news. However, it's still unclear. It's extremely opaque how this is going to be disbursed, at what prices is this oil being sold, et cetera, et cetera. So we are a long ways to go. Still, there is no material improvement in the lives of Venezuelans, but there is a clear change in expectations and, without a doubt, an increase in the oil revenues collected.
So more oil revenues are being collected. Maybe people's economic situation is not quite in free fall. We're going to talk a little bit about how much this is trickling down. Could I just get some clarification, because I'm not sure all listeners know about this idea of the United States controlling or having their hand on the spigot of all Venezuelan oil revenues? I mean, it almost sounds like a caricature from an 18-year-old leftist college student of what U.S. Latin American relations look like, or the way they did maybe 100 years ago. Is it that extreme, or does this have advantages and disadvantages?
It could potentially have some advantages if this is done in a transparent way and helps to
Right.
reduce the misuse or the corruption in the allocation of the resources in Venezuela. But so far, the only thing we know is that oil from Venezuela can only be exported authorized by United States Treasury Department through
Wow.
an OFAC license. And then money has to go to an account. Originally, it was in a bank in Qatar. Currently, it's in the U.S. And the U.S. basically has to authorize sending that money back to Venezuela. So far, they have sent about $1 billion to exchange them to Venezuelan bank, and the Venezuelan government has received the bolivars from that. So that has changed the expectations of the devaluation, stopped the perception of a free fall in the currency and the expectation of hyperinflation. But it's not clear at all how the money is going to continue to be disbursed, what will be the rules, what will be the checks and balances, the accountability in how this money is spent. So we know that the total amount of revenues is going up because there is less discounts and there is no blockade. But do we know how it's going to be used? No, we don't.
Wow. Nor do we even know what is the balance on that treasury account.
No.
Laura, before we get more into the oil economy and similar issues, what's your response to that notion that Venezuela is better off than it was 8 or 9 weeks ago?
Well, that's part of the complexity of understanding the role of the U.S. in the region, and in particular in Venezuela, which was under an authoritarian government that the structure still remains in place. Regardless of our very strong critique to the U.S. administration's approach to Venezuela and what happened on January 3rd, the reality is that date changed the course of history in Venezuela, and it has created some openings. Venezuelan independent civil society is trying to seize that moment and regain their agency to push for a genuine democratic transition. Regardless of whether we consider this a transition or not, the reality is that you can still not add the last name of democratic to that current context. Right now, there have been, since January 8 until March 8, over 600 political prisoners have been released. There was the approval of an amnesty law that is still very complex, and it has a lot of voids that should be definitely improved. But the reality is that it has created that opening. We have seen people protest in places where it was unthinkable to protest, like the Central University in Caracas, and some openings even of journalists speaking out or members of the opposition. But still, the repressive apparatus remains in place. So it is important to continue pushing for those democratic openings because, as Francisco has mentioned also in different publications, it is not possible to have a real increase in the economy and an improvement of the economic conditions without a return to the rule of law. And I just wanted to also add something to the conversation that we were just having with Francisco, and is that when Venezuelans go to a supermarket right now, they don't really feel a change. And it is important to keep this in mind. Venezuela has been undergoing a complex humanitarian emergency, at least since 2014, a collapse of the public services. And in this context, according to Venezuela and other partners, there are over 12.4 million Venezuelans that are facing either severe or critical humanitarian needs. And the humanitarian response plan is still very insufficient to respond to those needs. If you are a Venezuelan earning approximately $270, you go to the supermarket and what you need to feed your family a month is over $500. So the purchasing power of Venezuelans has not increased in such a short period of time. And the other very key point that is affecting Venezuelans is the gap between the official price of the dollar by the Central Bank of Venezuela and the parallel dollar that you get in the black market. And that gap is almost 50%. So
Stunning.
Venezuelans are suffering still from these economic conditions, but there are a lot of high expectations that things will improve in the upcoming year.
I think expectations may be the real theme here. If we are to have some sort of a soft landing or a smooth transition in Venezuela, Venezuelans all voted a year ago in July for the opposition. And so far, that hasn't been really even mentioned, and the winners of that election are not back in Venezuela. So there's expectations probably for democracy, for having more ability to speak out openly, to see more people released from Venezuelan prisons, for some semblance of rule of law or accountability for corruption. I mean, a lot of those are longer term things, and folks like Secretary Rubio have been saying, we're going to get there, but we're going slow on purpose. As you said, there's going to be expectations. You're hearing about all these oil contracts. You're seeing all these investors coming to Caracas. So you're like, why can't I buy more things in the supermarket? Why aren't the lights on yet? Why can't I eat 3 meals a day? Now, the change doesn't have to be night and day, but one would expect people to feel something measurable from day to day. Dr. Monaldi, how well is the Trump administration, but perhaps also the Delcy Rodriguez regime, managing expectations right now?
As Laura said, there are expectations of economic improvement that are widespread according to polls. And even, the expectation that the political side is also going to improve. Although, for example, most Venezuelans want elections to happen in 2026, for example. And in terms of the economy, so far is mostly about expectations, but there are some reasons to be hopeful in the sense that Venezuela is so dependent on oil, and the economy had contracted so dramatically that any increase in oil production in 2026 will lead to some relevant growth of the economy and less inflation and lower devaluation of the currency. And all that should improve the income of average Venezuelans. And so we should see some prosperity comparatively the rest of the year. But it depends a lot on how the U.S. manages the funds that are coming from Venezuelan oil exports, and also on the side of the Venezuelan government, what do they do with those funds? In terms of initial investment, we can see, for example, that companies that are already there and that have already contracts and that were ongoing investments like Chevron and Repsol from Spain are going to be the first to increase production. And that should generate some additional relief, other than the fact that the oil is being sold at a higher price and with less discount. But as Laura mentioned, from the perspective of the longer term, from the perspective of sustainable recovery, Venezuela needs more than $100 billion of investment in the oil sector to get back to the production that it had 20 years ago. And that will not happen without a clear path towards the rule of law in Venezuela, towards clarity. Because even though, some people ask me, well, but oil companies do not care about democracy. They invest in many places that are not democratic. Probably true. I mean, that's not what they focus on. They do focus on the rule of law. And in the case of Venezuela, I don't think we will see a stable rule of law and our relation with the U.S. and European countries that is stable unless we get a transition to democracy.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, it's often been said that an oil company really just wants predictability, especially if you're going to lay out cumulatively an amount like $100 billion. You want a guarantee that you're going to get that back. And then, of course, the Venezuelan people want that to trickle down. Let me stay with you, Dr. Monaldi, on this. I think in the past, Venezuela had a lot of oil wealth, but it wasn't always well shared, which is why whenever the price of oil went down, there was often unrest in the country, way before Hugo Chavez. Trickling down, there must be a better economic term for that, but trickling down seems to have been a constant challenge. What are the bottlenecks to that happening already? You mentioned the Treasury Fund, which I'm no expert in U.S. Treasury law. I don't know if any of us three are, but I'm not even sure what the legal regime is here in the United States that would regulate that. But clearly, if that's not transparently managed, that's a huge bottleneck. And then once it hits the central bank in Venezuela, what is the next bottleneck in terms of trickling?
Yeah, this is where the concern about how things are managed in a country that has the highest level of corruption in the world. I mean, in Transparency International or in the World Bank indexes, Venezuela is just third from the bottom up, so of about 180 something countries. And then there aren't any institutional changes to that so far. So that is a very challenging situation. Venezuela has had massive cases of corruption related to the oil sector. And one might expect that, for example, the way the money was brought back from the black market was so corrupt that anything that is done now is going to be an improvement, and it probably will be. But again, it's really important to have a lot of transparency and clarity. To give you an example, one parallel with what was happening currently in Venezuela is the oil for food program in Iraq, during Saddam Hussein. That was a UN program. And there were a lot of accusations of corruption during that period. So this is not easy, to handle. It could be an amount of $20 billion over a year. And how is this allocated? One example, so far, we know that the Central Bank of Venezuela decides who gets the dollars and who doesn't get the dollars. The only sort of limit to compliance right now is that the buyer of the dollars has to be in the SWIFT system. So meaning that it has to have access to the U.S. banking system. And that has some level of compliance because, U.S. banks have to analyze the customers and the transactions. But other than that, there is no other accountability. And on top of that, the Venezuelan government is deciding at what price each importer gets the dollar. So that opens, and as Laura said, we have a significant difference between the official exchange rate and the parallel market exchange rate. And the opaqueness in the way that this is being done is, to me, concerning. Even in the first stage of this, one would expect that the U.S. government, the U.S. Treasury, the U.S. State Department will, because as you said, there is no legal grounding for this, but they will regulate this in a way that is transparent, that is done through mechanisms that are like auctions or things that guarantee that this money is not being misused. However, that still gives the issue of how then the government of Venezuela spends the money. In Venezuela, there is no national budget until recently, almost no figures, official figures for the economy. Recently, they are starting to
No published budget.
No published budget. That is tremendously concerning.
That sure is. But yeah, Laura, we put this often under the category of rule of law when we're talking about how to release these bottlenecks. And we've mentioned transparency, we've mentioned accountability, or at least increasing the probability of accountability, particularly for corruption, as getting over those bottlenecks. You who know the institutional structure in Venezuela and how power has been working in Venezuela, I mean, what are some steps needed there?
I think in Venezuela, it's very important to understand in the context of a country that has been ranked 180 out of 182 of the Index of Perception of Corruption by Transparency International, a country that has dismantled all of their democratic institutions, and a country in which the UN fact-finding mission has issued a report specifically on the role of the judiciary in the commission of gross human rights violations, and it lacks completely independence and impartiality. It is not easy to go from this stage in which the country is towards a democratic transition, but it is important also to hold the U.S. accountable to understand what are their benchmarks when it comes to supporting a foreign policy that actually bolsters democracy rather than helps an authoritarian adaptive government to stay in power, which is what is happening right now with Delcy Rodriguez. And we see also conflicting agendas, I think, within the administration. Secretary Rubio, in February 25th, he was speaking from the Caribbean, and he gave some good remarks saying, there needs to be media environment, participation of the diaspora to be able to vote. He spoke about the need for political movements and parties to operate. Candidates need to be able to campaign. He even spoke about the need for strong civil society. But then at the end, he said this government knows that if they want investment, they need to legitimize themselves through an election. And that little part at the end concerned me, because it is not about legitimizing this government that is responsible of gross human rights violations. It's about actually having free and fair elections. So I guess my answer would be, first, I think the administration needs to be clear on the foreign policy towards democracy and have benchmarks on what it is expecting to see in terms of democratic change. And we have laid out from WOLA with a group of local organizations 10 urgent actions that need to happen. The derogation of the laws that have been used to persecute the release of political prisoners. There are still over 700 people detained today.
Many.
That many, yes. So we need to continue pushing for these changes not to be just cosmetic. And I would emphasize the need to recover an independent and impartial judiciary. I think that is part of the key in order for everything else to happen. For election results to be respected, you need an impartial judiciary. Otherwise, you will have what happened on July 2024. And the other aspect is also Congress here in the U.S. plays a key role in the oversight. I think it was very important and relevant to see bipartisan agreement and questioning to Secretary Rubio at the hearing that was held in January in the Senate, and also these questions about transparency when it comes to the oil proceeds. And that is something that civil society and the diaspora here need to continue pushing as well as inside Venezuela.
You mentioned Venezuela's judiciary. I have not heard that from Trump administration officials. I hear a lot about oil, a lot about counter-narcoterrorism, a lot about keeping out the Chinese, and maybe about receiving a lot of migrants, occasionally about releasing political prisoners. But the judiciary and similar institutions sounds so important right now, especially if you are thinking of investing something like $100 billion. You want to have some real clarity and an ability to settle disputes and an ability to ensure that property rights are guaranteed. I'm not even talking about the human rights and humanitarian aspects of this. Dr. Monaldi, I mean, in what state is the judicial branch, especially as it would relate to the security of investors?
Yeah, that's clearly very concerning. And as you point out, we have to work in parallel, improving the economic conditions of the country with rebuilding the institutionality, because otherwise this is not going to be a sustainable path to our prosperity. One clear example is in the oil sector. They changed the hydrocarbons law in Venezuela, and the provision that is trying to get some credibility to the rule is mostly about international arbitration. Yes, you need to give investors some guarantees while the institutions are rebuilt in the country. But just by passing, the institutional reforms and looking for some short-term solutions, I don't think it's going to do the trick for the large part of the investment. Another example, the administration of Nicolás Maduro with Delcy Rodriguez at the helm gave 31 oil contracts. So partly sort of privatized the PDVSA part of the oil production. About half of Venezuela's production is done by joint ventures with foreign companies. The other half is done by PDVSA. And PDVSA has given these companies a contract on their part. And it's not clear who got those contracts, the way they were allocated, the details about how much taxes do they pay, because everything was done using a so-called anti-blockade law that gave the government absolute authority to do that. The reform of the hydrocarbons law just said that those contracts are legal. But now the U.S. government is realizing that this was done in a very opaque way that didn't necessarily end up these contracts in the hands of legitimate companies that can increase production. And Reuters and Bloomberg are reporting that the U.S. is telling Delcy Rodriguez that they have to cancel those contracts. But it's not clear if that is going to happen. But let's think then about the future. The new law offers tremendous discretion to the Minister of Oil, which today is actually Delcy Rodriguez. He hasn't given up to set taxes, either the royalties at 0% of gross revenue or at 45%. So massive leeway. For companies, of course, that uncertainty is not attractive at all. But let's say that they put in the contract the detail and then they enforce it with arbitration. Who's going to decide which rate pays each company? Who is going to decide which companies are invited to participate in these contracts? In other countries, this is done with a transparent system of auctions or bidding rounds. Nobody's talking about that in Venezuela. And so you can see that just in the part of the allocation of oil production contracts is a reflection of the issue that we are just talking about the rule of law, right? There are no institutions in the country to do this. Is the U.S. going to take over the process and guarantee that it's done in a transparent way? How are they going to do it? Is the Department of Energy going to be allocating the contract? So there are a bunch of question marks. And in a country like Venezuela, this is a little bit like the Russia of, post-Soviet Russia. The way these contracts are allocated could dramatically affect the future of the country for decades to come. Because you're talking about contracts that last 20, 30 years. And so this could be privatization as the Russian privatization was, in which some oligarchs become super wealthy, or foreigners take over the sector without transparency, or it could be an opportunity to do the right thing. But so far, I don't see any indication that a system is being built for this to happen in the proper way. I hope it's going to happen, but so far, I haven't seen any indications.
So I'm very struck by the figure of $100 billion that would be needed just to bring Venezuela's production back to where it was, say, 20 years ago, which I guess is about a threefold increase. That is it. Unless you're NVIDIA or OpenAI, that's a lot of money. And any corporations or group or sector that is willing to put up that kind of money, you think would have a lot of leverage in deciding at this crucial turning point what these contracts, what these arrangements will look like in the future. If you're willing to put that money up, you probably have a lot of say in this. I'll start with you, Laura. For the private sector at this crucial moment, if they are to be better citizens here, which seems to be in their interest long-term as well, what should they be demanding be part of these deals? I think we've identified some of these untransparent areas and the powers that the oil minister has, including in the human rights and rule of law. Because I think people may be wondering why WOLA is talking so much about oil investment right now. What should the private sector be demanding about this?
Well, I think in order for these companies to demand security, legal security for their own investments, it is in their interest to demand some return to the rule of law. Of course, I think the civil society, independent civil society, plays a key role in pushing for these changes. But oil companies are the ones that have the leverage right now. And we saw this famous quote, or that became very famous, from the CEO of ExxonMobil during that meeting with President Trump, where he said Venezuela is uninvestable because
Right.
ExxonMobil is owned billions of dollars that Venezuela never paid to them, despite arbitrations that favor them. So there are a lot of creditors still waiting for that money to be paid to them. I do think that oil companies can play a role in pushing for those changes, but we've also seen companies that have worked in Venezuela despite being an authoritarian government. Chevron, for example, was a company that never left Venezuela, whereas other companies decided to leave. And the other problem is that starting in 2015, a lot of oil was discovered in Guyana, and Guyana has a common law system and a lot more political stability than Venezuela. So oil companies also see a lot of ups instead of downs in investing in this country rather than in Venezuela. So my point being, I think that the private sector has a lot of leverage as well, because Delcy Rodriguez and Jorge Rodriguez, because you need to see them always like they operate. Jorge Rodriguez is the president of the National Assembly, and he also holds a lot of power in Venezuela and their brothers. So they always operate kind of in tandem. And if you look at the Rodriguez brothers, you know that their interest is in keeping some sort of relationship with the private sector. So keeping that in mind and that political dynamic, I think it would be in the interest of oil companies and the members of the private sector to push for these democratic openings. Whether that is realistic or not, I think it depends also a lot on the U.S. and if the U.S. is actually willing to push for a more transparent foreign policy that creates those democratic openings.
If there is indeed a push from the oil sector, and yes, I understand listeners expecting oil companies to be agents of democratic change is a bit ahistorical, but it's certainly a possibility here. But if there is a push for greater transparency, for more accountability for corruption, for some semblance of a rule of law, even if it's not turning a switch, even if it's just gradual, any change in the status quo is going to hurt a lot of powerful interests inside of Venezuela. Some of them illegal, some of them violent. A lot of what we're calling to do here will involve kicking some hornets' nests inside Venezuela. Should we be concerned about more instability, more insecurity, perhaps something that could even draw the Trump administration to feel it has to send military personnel? Or is this more, I know the oil industry always says they always factor security into their costs, and this is just part of the calculation. How big of a concern is security looking out into the medium term, Dr. Monaldi?
The oil industry, as you point out, has operated in countries with a lot of security issues, including neighboring Colombia, for example.
Yeah.
However, when they think about the longer term, and as you mentioned, investments of $100 billion, you can see a very different approach in two types of projects and companies. One thing is a company like Chevron. They are already in Venezuela. They already have a significant cash flow coming out of Venezuela. They are just having to reinvest part of that cash flow. And so they are not putting any additional capital. They are not asking their shareholders to take their money out of their pocket and put money into Venezuela. So it makes a lot of sense for them to operate even in circumstances that are quite risky. In the case of companies like Exxon or Conoco, that not only are owed billions of dollars, but that they don't have an operation there, they would have to invest in what we call greenfields. Like you have to develop the whole infrastructure of the project. That is billions of dollars before you see any money. That's not going to happen unless they see all these things. And that's why, they, as Laura mentioned, they could be a force to push for, at least for rule of law. They might not care about democracy, but as I mentioned before, I think the democracy and rule of law in the case of Venezuela come together. This is not which you could have a stable authoritarian regime in Latin America that provides very strong guarantees for the rule of law. Having said that, I think that there might be some projects in the oil sector that are quick return, high return in the horizon of the 3 years that the Trump administration is going to be in power. And that's the kind of investment, besides the incumbent, the companies that are already there, that we might see. And so people might get confused at the beginning that, oh yeah, there is some investment, but notice the dramatic difference. If what you're talking about is an oil field that already has all the infrastructure that was operated until recently by PDVSA, and is now given to a small American company that is specializes in recovering production of a declining oil field, that's basically a very short-term and low risk from the perspective of the revenue generated type of investment. But that will not get you very far. That will get you to, say, 1.5 billion barrels, perhaps two, but not the kind of investments that Venezuela requires to recover. And even though, of course, you might ask yourself, why Venezuela is going to continue to be so oil dependent? Well, the problem is a country that has had all the issues that Venezuela has had. The only sort of industry that is likely to obtain the type of investment that we're talking about and lead to some economic growth, at least in the first stage, before all the other conditions come back into place, it's the oil industry. So that's why we are so focused on getting this industry back to previous levels of production.
Because Venezuela has had all of the institutionality dismantled, it is important also to consider that these companies, PDVSA was responsible for a lot of environmental damage due to mismanagement. And because this institutionality is not back in place, our legal frameworks is not up to date in terms of international standards for environment protection and also for corporate responsibility in general. I would say that in a context in which the U.S. basically stopped sending humanitarian aid to Venezuela, because what we're seeing right now, the images of the new charge d'affaires in Venezuela receiving medicines, those are basically being sold. Those are not part of the humanitarian response plan. So I would add that these companies could also play a role, if they wanted to, in the development of the communities nearby this oil fields, contributing to education programs, contributing to access to water and other conditions. Oil companies are not characterized by this in general, but I think it's important for us as an international human rights organization to put this forward and say that there needs to be oversight in the way that they operate, considering the humanitarian conditions in Venezuela and the previous damage done by the administration under Maduro and under Chavez because of mismanagement and corruption.
Unfortunately, we are running low on time because we had some technical difficulties earlier that I would love to talk about this for many more minutes. But maybe as a way of concluding, we have painted a picture here of a nation that has rising expectations and has reasons to have rising expectations, but really just has one source of income with which to meet those expectations, to recover, to diversify, to be more green in at least the medium to long term. But that requires breaking the so-called resource curse, making sure that this revenue is spent wisely, and they need the money as soon as possible. My question is, it is a bit frustrating to be talking about this 19th century fossil technology as Venezuela moves deep into the 21st century. But for now, that's what they've got. Assuming that we do get some measure of rule of law, some measure of democracy, that oil companies actually do play a positive role, and that Venezuela can diversify. And I know we've partially answered this, but what are some of the ingredients needed and things that the Trump administration perhaps is overlooking or not doing enough right now? Sorry for the vague question, but this is sort of call to action part of the podcast.
I'm concerned, as Laura mentioned, that the Trump administration so far is focusing in very specific things, in particular, getting back oil production up, and now they're talking about mining. But in order to really build a program for recovery of the Venezuelan economy and to rebuild the institutions, they need to start having a plan for transition to democracy, for rebuilding the judiciary, for creating independent institutions. And so far, we don't see that the effort in those areas shows any significant progress. They first need to stabilize the economy as a priority, but we need to see the other pieces start to be put in place. And as you point out, Venezuela is not going to be a prosperous, thriving democracy as was at some point, or as others in the region have been, just by producing oil. First of all, because there is an energy transition ongoing, and fossil fuels are going to be a declining share of energy production in the next few decades. But in addition to that, Venezuela, even if it produced 5 million barrels of oil as it could have used with the current population, doesn't lead to the prosperity that Venezuela had in the past. So the so-called resource curse, Venezuela has to do two things at the same time. One is, yes, the oil industry has to be recovered. That's the best bet in the short term. But second, the country needs to keep the focus that cannot be the development model of the country. Mm-hmm. And of course, sadly, or for good or bad, that makes institutions the more important, because in order to get investment in sectors that are less profitable than oil, that are not extracted, you actually need a much stronger institutionality. You need low risk, low macroeconomic risk, low security risk, clarity about the rule of law, all those things that, say, let's put a country, Uruguay has been able to do in the region. So that will take time, but without those things, Venezuela will continue to be an oil-dependent economy, which will mean that when the price of oil declines, again, there will be a lot of political and social instability. And even worse, when oil ceases to be such an important commodity, the country could again enter into a declining situation.
Yeah, I mean, Venezuela does risk being lost in an eventual clean energy transition. And if there is no focus, really, both from whoever's ruling Venezuela, but pushed by the Trump administration to move more toward a rule of law democracy, and it's just about the oil, I fail to see why they couldn't have just negotiated that with Nicolás Maduro. Laura, I mean, just turning to you for the final word on the more forward-looking steps that need to be taken.
I think this administration started the military buildup talking about security in the region and how Venezuela was basically a safe haven for illicit economies. And we have talked about this in previous podcasts and debunked some of those statements, but also asserted some of them. Yes, because it is true that corruption and illicit economies are embedded within the institutionality. So if the U.S. really wants to make the hemisphere safer, those illicit economies and that safe haven will continue to be that. And also, the other main point of the administration was curbing migration. Well, migration is fueled by poverty and by this complex humanitarian emergency. So if you actually want to make the hemisphere safer and you want to stop the reasons that make people leave the country, then you need to revert the complex humanitarian emergency. And that is not something that is solved just with money. That is solved with political will, with policies, and with a robust institutionality. So the end goals that the administration is pushing for, at least this is what they're saying in the 3-stage plan that Secretary Rubio has laid out. If you actually want to accomplish that, you need to accompany this foreign investment in Venezuela with a push for the actual and genuine democratic transition. And that means rebuilding the institutionality. That means releasing political prisoners, not tolerating these cosmetic changes that are not genuine, and helping Venezuelans create the conditions that they need for free and fair elections, which won't happen unless this repression stops. Just this past week, we saw another media outlet close in Venezuela, in Puerto Ordaz. But nobody's speaking about this. Like publicly, people feel like, oh, everything is better. But no, we are still seeing certain detentions and closures in the civic space, it's a mixed bag of hopes and contrasts that we're seeing. So I think it is important to continue pushing for this, and also I would say emboldening the Venezuelan democratic civil society, because I think that without an independent civil society, it will be impossible to continue pushing for these changes.
Thank you to both of you. I learned a lot. I'm sure our listeners will too. I learned a lot about the rising expectations currently in Venezuela, the fact that they will simply not be met without the rule of law, that an accountable dictatorship is not something we should expect in Venezuela, that there needs to be democracy as part of this rule of law formula, and that the private sector, particularly the oil sector in the short term, has a huge role to play in this. And of course, the Trump administration needs to be much more explicit about all of this, including in its own transparency over its management of Venezuela's oil revenue. Those are all excellent messages, and I really appreciate you spending the time to share them and to explain them so clearly. Thank you again for joining the podcast, Dr. Francisco Monaldi and Laura Dib.
Thank you, Adam.
Well, thank you again for listening, and many thanks to Francisco Monaldi and to Laura Dib for that very clear explanation of the current moment 9 weeks after the Trump administration's military operation in Venezuela. Expectations are rising, and so much hinges on transparency, accountability, and the rule of law. A lot of things need to be happening in these weeks and months, and it's not yet clear that they are. Please do stay tuned. We will keep the podcast episodes coming. As I mentioned at the beginning, as with all that WOLA does and produces, we depend on support to make these episodes happen. If you're a supporter, thank you for making our work possible. If you're not, just remember that you could be very easily. Either way, though, thank you for listening. Stay well, and goodbye for now.